The courtroom was packed in Houston, Texas. Cold fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the rigid wooden benches where the victim's family sat in silent sorrow. Opposite them, Richard's mother bowed her head, her trembling hands clutching a crumpled handkerchief. Everyone awaited the final verdict from Judge William, known for his ironclad rulings and uncompromising stance. He entered the courtroom in his authoritative black robe, his cold eyes scanning each face without a hint of emotion. William had sat on the bench for over 2 decades, presiding over hundreds of serious cases. He believed in the law with absolute conviction and never hesitated to deliver the harshest sentences to uphold justice. To him, criminals had to pay for their actions, and Richard, the defendant in an armed robbery case that left a man hospitalized, was no exception. Richard, 26, stood before the court, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. He was a mechanic, with no criminal record, and had consistently claimed his innocence. But all the evidence was stacked against him: blurry surveillance footage, fingerprints on the gun found in his storage unit. His desperate gaze drifted toward his mother, the only person who still believed him in this suffocating room. Standing in the corner, Detective David crossed his arms, a smug smile playing on his lips. To everyone else, he was the hero who solved the case, but no one knew he was the mastermind who orchestrated the whole setup. As Judge William settled into his chair, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. He glanced at Richard, his face hardening. To him, Richard was just another criminal trying to escape justice, hiding behind pleas of innocence. The evidence was clear, and William's confidence in the system was unshakable. But beneath that iron resolve lay a man who had grown numb from years of dealing with criminals, his sense of justice slowly morphing into cold, mechanical punishment. Richard stood before him, his shoulders sagging under the weight of accusations that felt as heavy as the chains around his wrists. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice cracking as he insisted, "I didn't do it. I was at home with my mother that night." But his words fell flat, echoing off the indifferent walls. His alibi had already been dismissed, labeled as a desperate lie from a cornered man. The prosecutor painted a damning picture: a desperate mechanic drowning in debt, resorting to robbery as a quick fix. Witnesses identified Richard's old truck leaving the crime scene. His fingerprints on the gun sealed his fate. Each piece of evidence was a nail in his coffin, methodically hammered in by Detective David. David watched from his spot near the jury, his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk tugging at his lips. To the courtroom, he was a hero, the relentless detective who brought justice to a grieving family. But behind that confident facade was a man who had meticulously crafted a web of lies. He had planted the gun in Richard's storage unit, manipulated witnesses, and ensured the blurry footage vaguely matched Richard's appearance, all to close the case quickly and earn another commendation. Judge William's gaze flicked to David, his trusted detective. He had worked with David on countless cases, admired his dedication and sharp instincts. Never once did he suspect the corruption hiding behind that loyal demeanor. But Richard's eyes saw through the charade. His gaze locked onto David, a flash of realization tightening his jaw. It all made sense. The evidence that appeared out of nowhere, the coincidences that piled up. Rage boiled in his chest. But in this courtroom, his words meant nothing. William cleared his throat, ready to deliver his judgment, unaware of the deception poisoning the justice he swore to uphold. The gavel slammed down, its echo lingering as Judge William announced his verdict. Guilty on all counts. His voice was firm, devoid of hesitation. A murmur swept through the courtroom as Richard's shoulders collapsed, the weight of the word crushing him. He stood frozen, his legs trembling, his world shattering piece by piece. From the corner of his eye, he saw his mother's face crumple, her muffled sobs breaking through the cold silence. Richard's knees nearly buckled when the guards tightened the cuffs around his wrists, their grip bruising, unyielding. "I didn't do it," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "You're sending an innocent man to prison." His words were sharp, raw, but they fell on deaf ears. To Judge William, his outburst was nothing more than the desperate, Cries of a guilty man unwilling to accept his fate. William watched as Richard was dragged away, his expression unchanging. He believed he had served justice, relying on the evidence meticulously presented by Detective David. But behind that mask of certainty, cracks were forming. A whisper of doubt nudged at his conscience, a faint unease he refused to acknowledge. After all, the system was built on facts, and the facts were indisputable, or so he thought. David stood at the back of the courtroom, his lips curling into a satisfied grin. It was another victory for him, another case closed. But beneath, the smug exterior was a predator who had played the system perfectly. He watched Richard's despair with cold detachment, feeling no remorse for the life he had destroyed. To him, the end justified the means. And now, his fabricated evidence had locked an innocent man away, erasing the truth beneath layers of lies. As the doors slammed shut behind Richard, the courtroom buzzed with conversation, spectators debating the trial's outcome. But to Richard, it was all a distant hum. His reality was the harsh clank of chains, the suffocating sense of injustice. He looked over his shoulder one last time, his eyes pleading, but Judge William had already turned his back, shuffling papers, moving on to the next case. Yet even as William resumed his routine, the nagging feeling of doubt remained. Unseen, it took root, slowly unraveling his ironclad belief in a system he thought was infallible. And it was only a matter of time before the truth clawed its way to the surface. Weeks passed, but the echo of Richard's cries haunted Judge William. It reverberated through his thoughts, unsettling his once unshakable confidence. He found himself replaying the trial in his mind, each piece of evidence, every testimony. Something felt off, like a puzzle with forced pieces. But he silenced his doubts, convincing himself that his judgment was sound, rooted in facts. Yet his nights grew restless, his dreams tormented by Richard's anguished eyes pleading for justice. Meanwhile, in the cold confines of his prison cell, Richard's despair festered. The walls seemed to close in, the air heavy with hopelessness. Days blurred together, marked only by the clatter of metal doors and the distant murmurs of other inmates. But through the haze of misery, his resolve hardened. He was innocent, and he would prove it. He pored over every detail of his case, replaying each moment, every word spoken in that courtroom. There was no evidence placing him at the crime scene, only Detective David's testimony and the so-called proof he had presented. It didn't add up. Richard knew he was framed, but how could he fight back from behind bars? Determined not to become just another statistic, Richard wrote letter after letter, pleading for someone to listen. Most went unanswered, discarded without a second glance. But one letter found its way to an investigative journalist named Lisa, known for her tenacity and sense of justice. Intrigued by Richard's detailed account and unwavering claims of innocence, she began to dig into Detective David's history. What she uncovered sent chills down her spine. David's past was littered with questionable cases, suspects coerced into confessions, evidence that conveniently surfaced at the perfect moment. Patterns emerged, painting a portrait of corruption, masked behind a badge of authority. As Lisa connected the dots, she realized Richard wasn't the first victim of David's deceit, but he could be the last if she exposed the truth. Judge William's doubts grew heavier as whispers of David's misconduct reached his ears. Unease twisted in his gut, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable possibility that he had been played, that his courtroom had been used as a stage for David's lies. For the first time, William questioned his own role in Richard's fate. The weight of his gavel no longer felt like justice, it felt like guilt. The revelations unearthed by Lisa sent shockwaves through the community. Her exposé was relentless, detailing Detective David's manipulation of evidence, his coercion of witnesses, and his history of bending the truth to fit his narrative. The public outcry was deafening. People demanded accountability, their anger palpable as protests erupted outside the courthouse. Signs reading, "Justice for Richard" and "Corruption behind the badge" were hoisted high, voices rising in unison for the truth. Judge William watched the chaos unfold from his office window, his heart heavy with shame. The reports left no room for doubt. He had sentenced an innocent man guided by lies disguised as evidence. The walls of his office seemed to close in on him, the accolades and certificates mocking his failure to see through David's deception. He felt complicit, his gavel echoing like a weapon used against justice itself. He knew he couldn't stay silent. He had to make it right. Richard's hope was reignited as he read Lisa's article, his hands trembling as he clutched the newspaper. The truth was finally out, but freedom was still beyond his reach, and he knew the fight wasn't over. The system that had condemned him was powerful, and overturning his conviction would be an uphill battle. Yet, he refused to give up. His innocence was no longer his secret. The world knew, and that was enough to fuel his determination. Lisa continued, her investigation, her commitment unwavering. She found witnesses who admitted to being threatened by David, evidence that had been conveniently misplaced, and documents that contradicted David's testimony. Her courage inspired others to come forward, including officers who had turned a blind eye for too long. The truth was snowballing, gaining momentum too great to ignore. Haunted by his role in Richard's imprisonment, Judge William took the unprecedented step of reopening the case. His voice wavered as he addressed the courtroom, his gaze settling on Richard, who sat shackled but resolute. "I owe you justice," William admitted, his tone heavy with remorse, "and I won't rest until it is served." Detective David sat in the back, his jaw clenched, eyes darting nervously. The empire of lies he had built was crumbling, and he could feel the ground slipping from beneath him. But his fight wasn't over. He still had secrets to protect, and he would do whatever it took to save himself, even if it meant digging a deeper grave. The courtroom was charged with tension as the retrial began, spectators packing the gallery, their faces etched with anticipation. Richard sat beside his defense attorney, his back straight, eyes unwavering. He had spent years fighting for this moment, and he was ready to face his accuser. Detective David sat across the room, his expression steely, but his confidence had visibly waned. The walls were closing in, and he could feel the noose tightening as Lisa's damning reports continued to echo in the public's mind. Judge William presided over the hearing with a solemnity that hadn't been there before. Gone was the man who once saw justice as a matter of procedure. He was now someone determined to make things right. His voice was firm as he allowed the new evidence to be presented, the stack of documents and witness statements laid out for all to see. Each piece unraveled David's web of deceit, exposing the deliberate tampering of evidence, coercion of witnesses, and a history of misconduct that spanned years. Lisa took the stand, her testimony clear and precise. She recounted her investigation, how she connected the dots that had been purposefully scattered. She spoke of witnesses who had been intimidated, officers who had been complicit, and files that had been doctored to ensure Richard's conviction. Her words were sharp, cutting through David's facade, laying his corruption bare for all to see. The turning point came when one of David's former colleagues testified, revealing that David had coerced him into falsifying reports. The courtroom gasped as the officer's voice cracked with guilt, his confession shaking the very foundation of the prosecution's case. David's face paled, his hands clenching as his lies unraveled before him. Richard's attorney delivered a closing argument that resonated through the halls of justice. An innocent man lost his freedom because of a corrupt system. Today we have the chance to correct that wrong, he stated, his voice steady, yet impassioned. The jury's faces were grave, their eyes flicking between Richard and David, the eye contrast stark. An innocent man robbed of his life versus a guilty man desperately trying to cling to his. As the jury left to deliberate, the air was thick with anticipation. Richard's heart raced, his fate now resting in the hands of 12 strangers. But for the first time in years, hope felt real, tangible. The truth was out, and justice was within reach. All he could do now was wait. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with anticipation as the jury filed back in, their faces somber and unreadable. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the defense table. This was it, the moment that could either shatter his hope or set him free. Judge William's gaze was steady, his demeanor composed, but his eyes held a flicker of emotion as he addressed the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked, his voice resonating through the tense silence. The four persons stood, unfolding, a sheet of paper with shaking hands. "We have, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady yet laced with the weight of their decision. Richard's breath caught in his throat, the world narrowing to this single moment. Time seemed to freeze as she read aloud, "We find the defendant, Richard Thompson, not guilty on all charges." A gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by murmurs of disbelief and relief. Richard's vision blurred with tears, his body shaking with the force of emotions that crashed over him. Disbelief, joy, and a sense of freedom he had almost forgotten. His attorney clasped his shoulder, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it, Richard. You're free." Across the courtroom, David's face contorted with shock, his confident facade crumbling. The web of lies he had spun for years had finally caught up with him. Judge Williams' voice cut through the noise, calm but unyielding. "Detective David Lawson, please rise." David stood, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his own guilt. "Given the evidence presented and your abuse of power, this court finds you in contempt of justice. You are hereby placed under arrest for corruption, perjury, and obstruction of justice." Gasps echoed as two officers approached David, the very handcuffs he once used to imprison Richard now clicking around his own wrists. His face was pale, his arrogance shattered. Justice had come full circle. Richard stood as Judge William addressed him directly. "Mr. Thompson, on behalf of this court, I extend my deepest apologies for the injustice you have endured. You are free to go." The words were a balm to his wounded spirit. As he walked out of the courtroom, the sun greeted him with warm rays, a symbol of the freedom he had fought so hard to reclaim. For the first time in years, the world felt open, and his future was finally his own again. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, filled with the murmurs of onlookers who had witnessed the unraveling of lies and the restoration of justice. Richard stood on the courthouse steps, his face lifted to the sun as if feeling its warmth. For the first time, the weight that had crushed him for years was gone, replaced by a lightness that felt almost surreal. He drew in a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs, a symbol of his newfound freedom. His attorney stood beside him, a proud smile breaking through his professional composure. "You did more than clear your name, Richard. You revealed the truth." Richard nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. "I just wanted my life back. But I gained so much more." He looked back at the courthouse, knowing the battle fought inside those walls was not just for him, but for everyone who had been wronged by corruption. As reporters crowded around, microphones thrust forward, Richard spoke with a voice steady and resolute. "This isn't just my victory. It's a victory for justice, for everyone who's been silenced, wrongfully accused, or betrayed by the system. Today proves that the truth always comes to light." His words echoed, resonating with a public hungry for accountability. From a distance, Judge William watched, his heart heavy but hopeful. He knew the fight wasn't over. Reforms were needed, and the system had to change. But today justice had prevailed, and that was a start. Richard descended the steps, each step a move toward reclaiming his future. The road ahead would be long, filled with healing and rebuilding, but for the first time in years, he felt truly free. And that was more than he ever dared to hope for. The story of Richard's fight for justice serves as a powerful reminder that truth and integrity will ultimately prevail, even when faced with corruption and deceit. It teaches us the importance of resilience and courage in the face of injustice. Richard's journey shows that standing up for what is right may be difficult, but it is necessary to create change and restore faith in humanity. The story also emphasizes the significance of accountability within systems of power. It challenges us to question authority when it is misused and to seek fairness for those who have been wronged. In our daily lives, this narrative encourages us to advocate for justice, support those who are unfairly accused, and never lose hope in the power of truth. By learning from Richard's perseverance, we are reminded that each of us has the potential to make a difference and inspire change in our own communities.